Welcome to Taiwan Context. I'm Donovan Smith. All right, today by phone we have Felicia Lin, whose podcast, Talking Taiwan, has had some stellar guests and may be, quite possibly, the longest-running podcast out there on Taiwan. It's certainly the oldest one that I'm aware of, with the exception of ICRT's Talking Taiwan, Taiwan Talk and Taiwan This Week. There you go. You said that, people mix up the names. So, there you go. An actual example. Yeah. So when did Talking Taiwan start?
Well, I was approached by the producer in 2012, and the first episode was released in 2013.
Yeah, I was on the pilot prior to the show starting of ICRT's Taiwan This Week, but I think it came out a little bit after you did. That's my memory of it. So I believe that you have the oldest one, at least certainly that I'm aware of, on Taiwan.
Yeah, and the story is that it was the idea of Rick Monday, and so Rick Monday actually recorded some episodes, so you could say there are some episodes that predated 2013, but I don't think they're publicly available anywhere.
Right, okay. Yeah, I haven't seen Rick Monday in a few years now, actually. Yeah. So you're now a New Yorker, but you're originally from Alaska via Ottawa. How did you end up in New York?
Well, I think I've always been like a big city person. And so after I graduated, my first job brought me to New York, and it's stuck ever since. I love it.
So what was this job that brought you to New York?
Actually, believe it or not, I worked for a Taiwanese bank called Xiaotong Bank for a short time, and then I worked for JP Morgan and so on. Like, my background is actually in business and accounting, which really is not me. That was a very short-lived career. And then I went back to school for a very practical degree in psychology, a master's in psychology, and then proceeded to do some soul searching, went to Taiwan from 2001 to 2007, and I'm not doing anything related to that.
Okay. Well, you could do psychology of Taiwanese accounting. It sounds like you'd be perfect for it.
There you go. I'd like to get as far away from accounting as possible.
So now you're a New Yorker now, and I actually lived in New York City for a while. And one of the things I really noticed about New York City is it's both one of the most cosmopolitan places on the earth and one of the places on the planet where basically nothing exists outside of it. All geography is determined by the subway, and if the subway doesn't go there, with the possible exception of London, basically nowhere else exists. Everyone comes to New York. People in New York aren't interested in pretty much anywhere else. Now, you're a New Yorker. How did you get interested in Taiwan?
Well, my parents were from Taiwan, and growing up, they actually really gave me a very strong sense of Taiwanese identity. They were always like, your parents are from Taiwan. We're not from China. It's different. People may say that you're ethnically Chinese, but we're from Taiwan. We speak Taiwanese. We don't have any connection to China. And so that was drilled into me. Also, growing up, it was very interesting. I grew up with a lot of my cousins. My mother has 4 siblings, so she's the youngest of 5. And at one time, they all lived in Ottawa, Canada, which is where I grew up. So I had a very strong sense of Taiwanese identity. And my cousins would often go back to Taiwan during the summer to visit their Dawan Akong and Ama. And we never did. And so I was like, why is that? That's very strange. And then as I got older, I understood that my parents tried to apply for a visa, and there were always some kind of strange circumstances and some delays and whatever. So they're always very cautious, and there always was something very curious about that. And I later found out that when my parents got married, they were introduced through a mutual friend in Taiwan. And my dad was a professor at the University of Alaska, and that's how I ended up being born there. But before even getting to that point, he and my mother married in Taiwan. And after they got married, my mother wasn't allowed to leave Taiwan. My father actually had to go back to University of Alaska without her, which is kind of crazy. It's like, what is that? How does that happen? Right? And so when he went back to the university, everyone knew that he was getting married. Like, well, where's your bride? And so what happened was that through a lot of investigating, my mother found out that her brother, who was already in Canada, had been writing a lot of articles about Taiwan and his opinion about Taiwan. And he actually made a television appearance. Of course, he tried to conceal his identity and said something in support of Peng Mingming, who at the time was under house arrest and had escaped to Sweden and Canada eventually. And so that went into the family record because she later found out that because her brother had said these things, that it was on her family record. And then my father was also involved with some Taiwanese graduate student groups and so forth. So it's a very long story, but my grandfather, her father, knew somebody who had some connection with the police, and he helped her to find out what's going on. Meanwhile, my father in the United States was trying to have the senators, there were some Alaskan senators, and then also some other faculty at the University of Alaska that was trying to help him to resolve this situation. Eventually, my mother got the right connection to put pressure on the Kuomintang government, and my mother had an interview, and it was kind of crazy because when she had this interview, the person who was working for the police, who my grandfather knew, took her to the interview and said, "If you don't come out after a certain time, I'll come and get you."
Oh,
And he said, "Don't
oh
give them
man.
your ID, don't do this, don't do that." And I didn't even know until maybe about like 5 years ago. My mother told me more details that how she went into this windowless room and then they were interrogating her and they're like, "Did you know that your brother has like said all these things? And if you go to the States, you must tell him to stop doing this, and you're not allowed to do any media interviews," and like all this stuff. And then it was very dramatic. After she went through the interview, they told her, "You have like X amount of time to leave the country." And after that, the deal is off the table. So she had to leave very suddenly. She didn't know she was ever going to be able to go back to Taiwan because that was like, I think, 70. So, still under martial law. It was very intense time. And I think it was a couple months my parents were separated and they were going back and forth on this. And so hearing this story, it always like piqued my curiosity. And a lot of other things, like we always spoke Taiwanese at home because my parents told us the whole thing about how people were not allowed to speak Taiwanese when the Kuomintang came over and all this stuff. So I was really indoctrinated. But on the other hand, my sister and my cousins are not as involved as me, so maybe it affected me differently or something, or I just chose to go further with it. It was always just very curious to me. What was the
Hmm.
situation in Taiwan, and what was it that led to, like, what were the factors that made the situation the way that it was? And it wasn't until I think 89 or so, like definitely after martial law was lifted, that our family visited Taiwan for the first time.
Yeah, that would make sense. Early 70s, that was when people say that's when the KMT still had spies on U.S. college
Yeah,
campuses. And, the rumor is that Ma Ying-jeou was one of them. I don't know if that's
right,
true or not, but that's the rumor.
right.
So, was your mother interviewed by the Garrison Command?
Probably.
Because they were a scary bunch of people.
Yeah, yeah.
I arrived in Taiwan 1988, and the Garrison Command was still very much a thing. Taiwan was under martial law on the offshore islands. It was still a one party state, and they put in these national security laws in the late 80s that were basically martial law light, essentially.
Mhm, mhm.
Nylon dung was still around. So, yeah, I would guess it would have to be after 89 or 90 that it would have been okay for your family to come back. That
Right.
would, yeah, even 91 perhaps. Because I know a lot of people who were barred from returning here, people like Lynn Miles and these people,
Mhm,
and Peng Minmin,
mhm,
they weren't allowed back until 92, 93, 94,
mhm,
sort of in that
mhm,
period,
mhm,
when all these blacklisted people were allowed back in.
mhm.
So now you grew up in Canada, but you were raised very specifically Taiwanese. I'm sure there must have been a lot of pressure to identify as a CBC or Canadian born Chinese.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, the common response if you said, "Oh, I'm Taiwanese," or whatever, would be like, "Oh, but that's the same as Chinese, right?"
Mm.
But no, we always identified as Taiwanese because I had a lot of extended family, my cousins, like my mother's siblings, and then there was a Taiwanese Canadian Association, and we would regularly go to those community events and things like that. So I had a pretty strong sense of my Taiwanese identity.
Hmm. I remember back in the day here in Taiwan, you'd get a lot of visiting what were termed at the time ABCs and
Mhm.
CBCs, American
Mhm.
born or
Mhm.
Canadian
Mhm.
born Chinese,
Mhm.
and they would self identify as that. They would describe themselves as ABCs or CBCs.
No, I would
But
tell people I was an ABT.
yeah, there you go. But I think that was unusual back then. That wasn't that common. Now, I know that a
Yeah,
lot of people with ROC passports, a lot of them came from families that fled China, were
right.
in Taiwan for a little while,
Hmm.
got ROC citizenship, and then
Hmm.
moved on to the
Hmm.
US. So I know
Hmm.
that they made up a large percentage of the
Hmm.
diaspora. And the number of people from pre 1949 families was relatively low in the early days. But I think
Hmm.
by the 70s, there was a lot more.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think my family had a very strong sense of this. Like, even my mother's parents, my maternal grandparents, actually immigrated to Canada. I'm not sure when, but probably not long after I was born, because they felt very uncertain about the situation in Taiwan. And as we know, the Republic of China did lose a seat in the UN. So they weren't very sure about what the future of Taiwan was. All their kids were in Canada, so they immigrated there and they're buried there. They're buried in Ottawa.
Hmm. So now you've been in New York for how long now?
Oh wow. Since I graduated, that's gonna you're gonna know my age, but
Okay, a
yeah,
while. Well, we'll leave it at a
yeah.
while. Shall we say that?
Yeah, it's probably not hard for people to figure out how old I am, but yeah.
Yeah. So now you've been involved in the Taiwanese American community in New York. From the view from here in Taiwan, is it seems that the New York Taiwanese American community is very active. That's the feeling I get from here.
Yeah, I don't know how long they've been doing it, but every year when the UN Assembly in September, they have a demonstration which is for Taiwan's UN membership, and that's been going on for decades. So yeah, there's a lot of activism. I think I got more active when I was in college because that was the first time that I was away from home. And it was very different going to college in the US and Canada because people have a much stronger sense of their racial identity in the US. And that was very different for me going there and feeling the segregation. And at the time, there was a Taiwanese American Students Club that started at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, which is where I went to school for my undergrad. So I got involved with that group. Some of the people that I met through that group and also from other colleges on the East Coast and the Midwest, we formed a group called the Intercollegiate Taiwanese American Students Association, which is actually in existence now. And the idea of that organization was to have regional conferences so that Taiwanese American students could meet other students from other schools in the region. So they would have a conference in the Midwest and a conference in the East Coast, and then several schools in those regions would bid to be the conference host. And so that's where I really got involved. And then after I graduated, we wanted to continue the community. So I was involved with this group called the Society of Taiwanese Americans, which is not around, but it was similar to another organization, the Taiwanese American Professionals, which came afterwards, but it was similar to that. So we wanted to continue the Taiwanese American community beyond college for people who are in the workforce. So I
Now
was
you.
involved in the president with that organization for a while. Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Now you actually moved to Taiwan for a while.
Yes, I did. That was after my master's in psychology. So I was in Taiwan from 2001 to 2007. Guess I was kind of in a soul searching time. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with my master's. I had been doing a lot of work related to Taiwan, and I actually entertained going to the Peace Corps, and I actually applied and interviewed, but I didn't go through the final steps, which is getting references. And I kept meeting all these people who had gone to Taiwan and taught English in Taiwan and had lived in Taiwan and had all these experiences. And I started thinking, maybe I should do that because I've been so involved with Taiwan. I've never actually lived there. And what I'm really looking for is to just go to the other side of the world and experience something different. Why not go back to my roots? So that's when I decided to go to Taiwan.
What was your impression of Taiwan?
I had been there a couple times before, so I remember being in Taipei and I don't read Chinese. And so it's very funny because everywhere you go, there's a 7-Eleven. So it's very easy to get lost, if you don't know like landmarks and things. So
Yes,
it
and
was quite
foreigners.
funny.
For
Yeah.
those listeners who have not been foreigners here in Taiwan, we often use 7-Elevens and McDonald's as landmarks to describe how to get to places until you get to a certain level of fluency.
But is that really effective if there's so many 7-Elevens you could mistake it for the wrong one?
Yeah, I'm thinking about when I arrived, there was less 7-Elevens.
Yeah.
Now I don't use 7-Elevens or McDonald's anymore for, I
Right.
can read the newspapers, so I'm not exactly,
Yeah.
I just want the address. I'm fine with that. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, there
definitely.
was a lot of scooters, densely populated and so like busy. The sidewalks, if you walked along the street, were very uneven, going up and down, and you could trip very easily over things. And yeah, but it was also an interesting time. I actually chose to live in Kaohsiung because the reason why I went back to Taiwan is because I wanted to have a quote unquote Taiwan experience. And I felt that being in Taipei, I met a lot of people who were very similar to me, meaning like Taiwanese Americans and who are more international. And so I chose to live in Kaohsiung. And that was actually very challenging, but I did have a more Taiwanese or quote unquote local experience because a lot of the friends that I made there were Taiwanese, like people that were born and raised in Taiwan. It was much harder to find a social network for sure because there's not that many expats there, but that's not what I was looking for.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean. My first year in Taiwan, I was in Taipei, and then I
Uh-huh.
moved to Hemei
Oh,
Township in Changhua County for
wow.
my second, third, and I lived there for 2.5 years.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I was definitely never going to learn any Chinese if I stayed in Taipei.
Right.
So, what did you do in Kaohsiung?
I studied Taiwanese. I studied some Mandarin. My Mandarin should be a lot better than it is, but I think the fact that I can kind of have a conversation, basically not having any Mandarin because I didn't grow up with that. I spoke Taiwanese at home, but even that was not very fluent. So I took Taiwanese classes and I also taught English, of course. Yeah, so that's pretty much what I did.
I'm jealous. My Mandarin's all right, but my Taiwanese is pretty weak. I can I can deal with only very basic things in Taiwanese. So when you were here, I think it happened when you were here. You got involved in a project involving Su Beng. Did
Yes,
that?
that's right.
I mean, how did you get involved? Actually, why don't we start with just quickly? He's such a fascinating character. I
Hmm.
mean, the story behind him is incredible. It's one of these. You hear the story and you go, "Oh my God, how come there's a movie about this guy?"
Right.
Um, Now, later, I know that Michael Turton will be interviewing you at length on this. But just briefly, can you give our listeners a quick summary of who he was and what makes him so interesting? And then follow
Sure.
that with how did you get involved with him?
Sure. I could probably answer that at the same time. I was in Taiwan for a couple of years and thinking, like, maybe about 2 years or so, thinking, like, what's my purpose here? Should I be staying here much longer? Should I go back? And I always felt that I wanted to write something about Taiwan. And in 2003, I read a Taipei Times article, which happened to be an article written by Su Beng that was translated into English. It wasn't even about Taiwan. I think it was just basically about human rights or something. And I was just curious about the author. And I said to my mother, do you know who wrote this? And she told me, oh, yes, that's Su Bing. He actually wrote this book called The 400 Years of Taiwan's History, which was one of the first history books that was about Taiwan's history from a Taiwan centric perspective. In other words, not Taiwan as being a part of China or Japan or whatever, but from the Taiwanese people's perspective. And he worked with the communists undercover and he had a vasectomy because he was so committed to working with the communists, and he dedicated his life to Taiwan independence and so on. And my eyes just popped out of my head. I was like, what? This is an actual person? Like, this is so fascinating. And I couldn't stop thinking about this person. I'm like, I want to meet him. I'd love to talk to him and maybe I could write something based on his life because, I'm not a biographer or historian or anything. So when I approached him, it was just with that idea in mind. Like, I just asked him, could I interview you and then maybe I'll write something based on your life? And I remember when I met him, his response to that was, pardon my Taiwanese because I have an accent, but he said, "Zhenna we Taiwan ho." So if it's good for Taiwan, yes. If it's for the good of Taiwan. I'm a nobody. I didn't have any track record. I didn't have any publications or anything like that. So it was interesting how he was so receptive. It turns out that I didn't know that a lot of people of a certain political leaning had his book, The 400 Years of Taiwan's History. And it turned out that my parents had his book on the bookshelf of our home all these years, and I didn't know anything about that. So it's really quite funny how I discovered him in another way and that he's such an important person for Taiwanese. A lot of people were really impacted by his book. They had a sense of Taiwanese identity and consciousness from reading his book. He also had this noodle shop in Japan where okay, so I could talk hours about him. So the short story is that yeah, this is hard to make a short story, but he was working undercover with the Chinese communists because he was a socialist, so he is very idealistic about communism, but then he eventually realized the corruption and became very disillusioned with the communists. And then, so at the end of World War II, like about 49, he fled from China, escaped from the communists because they were trying to get him to join the party, but he already was very disenchanted and he escaped back to Taiwan, which is right after 228 Araba. Oh, this is another thing about him. He was plotting to assassinate Chiang Kai-shek, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is also something that he's known for. They were staking out Chiang Kai-shek and trying to figure out how they could pop him off. Yeah, and his plot was discovered because they were stockpiling some weapons, and those weapons were discovered, and then he had to go into hiding. At the time, it was very hard to get out of Taiwan, and then he realized one of the best ways to get out of Taiwan would be to stow away in a banana exporting boat, because at that time Japan was exporting a lot of bananas, or well, I'm not sure which direction it was. Maybe Taiwan was exporting to Japan. Regardless, these boats would be regularly going from Taiwan to Japan. So he figured out how to stow away in one of those banana exporting boats to Japan. And then when he got to Japan, he knew that he still wanted to do something through the underground for Taiwan. So he had a food stall where he sold Chinese dumplings and fried noodles, ironically, because he also realized that there were a lot of Japanese in China at the time and they really would miss that kind of food, because he was actually thinking about maybe doing Taiwanese food, but realized there was probably a bigger market for the Chinese food. It was a hit. His noodle style did really well. In a couple of years, he was able to buy this building. It's in Ikebukuro, Japan. It's still there. And he was also doing some underground activities. So there was people from Taiwan that were coming to Japan, and he was training them for his underground. And they were doing a lot of urban terrorism to destabilize the Kuomintang and so on. So that's one of several things that he was doing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, did he ever make noodles for you?
Yeah, he did cook for me. I actually did go to his noodle shop a couple of years after I started interviewing him, and I did stay there. And I went there recently in 2019. I would highly recommend it. The food is really delicious.
Yeah, because I've read a lot of descriptions of it, and they talk about these things happened on this floor, and these things happened on that floor. And, I mean, I can't remember the exact details, but it was kind of like the ground floor was a restaurant, and then upstairs it was plotting the overthrow of the
Yeah,
KMT.
yeah.
What was he like as a person?
I always found he was very sharp. He was in the 80s or 90s and he was very sharp. He was very good with dates. When you talk to him, it'd be like a little history lesson, because he'd be like, at this time, this happened and this was happening in the world. And so he'd give you like this whole context. Sometimes when I would ask him to clarify something because I was like, did you mean this or that? I was usually the one that was wrong and he would correct me
Hmm.
and tell me, no, 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 this is what I meant or this is what happened. And I'd have to like go back to my notes and be like, okay, right. And he was always very generous with his time. Whenever I interviewed him, he would give me the whole afternoon and we would talk. And he had a lot of energy. But I think it was also just because he had this drive and this determination and this will and this vision for Taiwan. Like he could just talk hours about that. Yeah.
So, what was his take? Now, this would have been the 2000s, and Chen Shui-bian would have been president at the time.
Hmm.
What was his take on the Chen Shui-bian presidency?
Oh, wow. That's a sticky subject.
Okay.
Well, let me answer it this way by saying that he had said that he doesn't think that Taiwan's democracy happened so quickly, and a lot of people are very anxious about Taiwan's international status and the independence of Taiwan and so forth. I do remember Su Beng saying he doesn't think it's the role of the leader of the country, the president of Taiwan, to say that. It needs to come from the people. So it needs to be a movement from the masses, from the public, to push the people in power towards independence. That's what he said. So I think he felt like some of the things that Chancellor Bing tried or that was a little bit premature because people were very anxious about Taiwan's status. But he didn't think it was the place of political leaders to do that unless they had the support of the people behind them.
Interesting. So now there's two people that are famous for writing during the Japanese era who wrote books on Taiwan history. The other being, and I'm trying to remember his name, I just flaked a little bit here, but Lien Chan's father
Mm-hmm.
or grandfather. And of course, that family then moved to China, got involved with the KMT. And of course, Lien Chan was KMT vice president and presidential candidate who lost twice. And he was the one who bridged the gap between the KMT and the CCP and started interactions between the KMT and the Chinese Communist Party, which there's some irony there. Did Su Beng ever talk about that? Because it was him and Lien, what's his name? He also wrote that history of Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the two of them that wrote the Taiwan history.
Right. Well, I mean, their perspective is very different because Su Bing's perspective is that the Taiwanese people have been colonized for so long. So that's part of the psyche that they need to break out of because they were part of the Qing dynasty, then there was the Japanese, then there was the Kuomintang. So if you read his book, unfortunately, I can't read the Chinese version, but I did read the English version, which is extremely, extremely abridged. I mean, the Chinese version is thousands of pages long, and the English version, I think, is only 150 pages. So that'll tell you something. But he wrote about it very much from the perspective of how the Taiwanese were treated by the different colonizers that were on the island.
Yeah. And of course, his name is a pseudonym.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. That's right. That's not his given name. It was a pen name because initially he wanted to write it under a pen name, but I guess he wasn't able to conceal his identity for too long. So the first character, Su, is, or Shi, is a history, like Li Shi, the second character of history, and then Ming, which is clear. So together it means clear history or to clarify history or bright
shedding
history.
light on history. Yeah.
Right,
That's various
right.
ways of translating it. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
The Bing is, Ming, and there's a shedding light on or clarity or, What is going on with that project?
A lot of logging, a lot of translation. There's going to be some background research because I certainly want to give context about his life because hopefully the people that read it will be people who may not be familiar with Taiwan or Asian history. So there's a lot of work behind that. It's been a lot of stops and starts because this is something that I do in my free time. But yeah, I'm looking forward to kickstarting it again. And maybe if I can figure out how to do that, I can, at the tail end of my project, finish it up in Taiwan if there needs to be any further research there.
I mean, it's such a fascinating story, but it's got to be tough.
Yeah.
I mean, he grew up under the Japanese Empire.
Yeah.
So you've got Taiwanese, which you understand. They probably used some written Taiwanese at the time. You've got the Japanese, which obviously I don't speak much. I don't know if you speak much Japanese.
No, I don't.
But a lot of the material related to him, I'm sure, is all in Japanese. That's got to be tough. And then, of course, later it's all in Mandarin.
Right.
So you've got multiple languages. It's got to be a daunting task.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to worry about that too much now, but I've also toyed with assembling a team of people to help me with certain things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to the finished product. I mean, it's definitely one of those subjects that really needs, there's not enough out about him, I think. I feel like his story is so fascinating and so interesting. But I'm not aware of any biographies of him, certainly not in English.
I don't think there's anything in English, at least nothing comprehensive. There are some books that have excerpts and so on, but nothing comprehensive.
Well, All right, move on a little bit here. Now, your podcast, I look through the list of the people that you've interviewed, and there's some amazing people on that list.
Thank you.
So I wanted to talk about this a little bit before we wrap up. And I highly encourage listeners to check out Talking Taiwan. The interviews that you've gotten and some of the people that you've interviewed, I mean, these are really high profile people, and you've asked them some great questions. What are some of the real standout shows that you think that you'd like to share with our listeners here?
Mhm. Well, I think our most popular episode, at least we did an end of the year of most best episodes in 2020. The top one was Jerome Keating, Understanding the History of Taiwan. And Jerome has done so much writing on Taiwan. It was really very informative episode. So that's a great episode for people who don't know the history of Taiwan or who just would like to get a summary. I think that's a great one. And then, oddly enough, related to him was a podcast with the owners of a Taiwanese American restaurant in Brooklyn, New York, Winson. That was a very interesting interview. That was Josh Koo and Trick Brown. I was expecting to be talking to them about how they started their restaurant, what's the concept behind it, all this kind of stuff. But I never expected to be going down the road of what is Taiwan, what's the history of Taiwan. They actually told me that when they were doing their research, they went to Taiwan and they actually sought out Jerome and they met with Jerome Keating and they were talking with him about the history of Taiwan because Trick said he really wanted to understand the culture and history behind it. So that was a really interesting connection. I also interviewed Garrett Vanderwees, who was the publisher of Taiwan Communique. That's a little bit lesser known, maybe not as popular episode, but I just love it because I think he made a really huge contribution at the time. There was
Mhm.
not a lot of publications or information on Taiwan during the White Terror era, and it's still available online. If you just Google Taiwan Communique, all of their publications are available. It was such an amazing resource, and he talked a little bit about what it required to get some of the information to write about situations at those times. We also covered the sunflower movement because I did a crowdfunding campaign in 2013, which brought me to Taiwan to do some more research with Su Beng. Coincidentally, I was there in 2014 and I was there for the sunflower movement. And so I have an interview with someone who was there that night talking about what happened when they broke into the legislative yuan. More recently, I interviewed Richard Wong, who's an English baseball announcer. During COVID, at the very beginning, Taiwan was one of the few places that had professional sports, and it was the only place in the world for a short time that had baseball. And so they started doing English announcing, so I had him on as a guest.
Back when they had
Yeah.
those cardboard cutouts of
Right.
fans in the stadium.
Yeah. So they had the cardboard cutouts in the stands. Yeah.
Yeah, and Taiwan got worldwide coverage because it was the
Yes.
only place in the world that had professional baseball going, and
Right.
it was really kind of embarrassing that it was the Chinese Professional Baseball League,
Yeah, that's
which
a
was
really strange
annoying.
misnomer. Yeah.
Yeah. Just before we went to level 3 here, the level 3 lockdown, I actually went out
Hmm.
for drinks with Jerome Keating.
Oh,
And an interesting thing about Taiwan Communique, it was really quite important. It's
yes.
not, most people aren't aware of it now,
Yeah.
but they would actually fax that to people. I mean, it was this underground, the authoritarian era, and then
Mm-hmm.
they would smuggle out news from
Mm-hmm.
Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Early on, they had to physically smuggle stuff out, and then later they'd figure out
Right.
how to use fax machines and phones and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then they would compile the information on what was going on in Taiwan into a newsletter. Then they would smuggle that back into Taiwan in the later days by fax.
Uh-huh.
It was completely underground. So, yeah, Garrett Vanderwees is definitely, yeah, that I'm sure was a fascinating interview. Of course, Jerome, he's written some great books and he really knows a lot. So I met with him the other day, and we went to a long conversation about the KMT chair race, deep dive into local politics.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, some of the people I've seen, you've interviewed Andrew Yang, the presidential candidate and New York mayoral candidate.
Yes, way before he showed any political aspirations. That was when he was working with this organization called Venture for America, supporting entrepreneurs in, I'm not sure how to term it, but less traditional cities somewhere like Detroit, where you wouldn't have a lot of business development.
Yeah, you had Gordon Chang.
Yes.
He's mostly China-oriented, but he does write on Taiwan.
Yeah, he talked about the Hong Kong security law.
All right. Well, just quickly, is there any more shows that you'd like to recommend check out to get familiar with your podcast?
There's a lot of stuff there. I mean, even more recently, I've done an interview with the founder of Yunhai Pantry. She is someone who started a business with Taiwanese ingredients, so different kinds of soy sauces and chili sauces. And it's very interesting because the soy sauce makers, they have a very special way of making it, how it's dried in the sun, and there's a whole mini documentary on YouTube about it and so forth. It was like interesting things like that. And then I've also interviewed the Mars rover driver, who is a scientist who's originally from Taiwan. And that was probably my most challenging interview because I am admittedly not really someone who's into space exploration. So I was very nervous about that interview and I had to prepare for it a lot. But I think it turned out well and he was so gracious. That was a really fun interview.
Yeah. If you're interested in Taiwan food, the experts now, I think in English, are Stephen Crook and Katie Hui-Wen Hung.
Mm-hmm.
They did a whole book, an excellent book on food,
Right.
Taipei Culinary Journey or something like that's the name of it. I forget the name offhand,
yeah.
but so they might be someone interesting to talk to.
Right.
All right. Now, if somebody wants to find your podcast, where would they go?
They can find us on almost any podcasting platform: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and of course our website, talkingtaiwan.com. We have a lot of exciting interviews coming up. There's a group that's organizing a Taiwan COVID fundraiser that I'm going to be interviewing very soon. That's probably going to be the next episode. I'm going to be interviewing someone who considers, well, I would say she's a disability activist, but she calls herself a social impact entrepreneur. And she's the founder of Diversability. That's Tiffany Yu. I'll be interviewing Taiwanese politicians, like different entrepreneurs, and someone about the semiconductor industry in Taiwan, because that's so interesting. And I thought it would be interesting to cover that. And we're having like the chip shortage now. So I thought that would be interesting to cover as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, all right. Well, thank you very much, Felicia, for joining us here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
So be sure to check out Felicia Lin at Talking Taiwan. There's a lot of great stuff on there. And of course, here on Taiwan Context, I'm Donovan Smith with guest Felicia Lin. Be sure to hit like and subscribe and hit that notification bell and all that good stuff. So once again, thank you very much, Felicia.
Thank you.
This has been brought to you by the Taiwan Report. For more content like this, become our patron at report.tw.
还有就是那个台湾狗啦，最喜欢我的台湾狗了。